Hello and welcome to Electoral Dysfunction with me, Beth Rigby.
Me, Ruth Davidson.
And me, Harriet Harman.
Hello everyone. Now, it's been lovely, can I say, to hear from so many of you this week. We've loved all your pictures and videos showing us where you listen to the podcast. Ruth, which was your favourite?
My favourite was the sheep shed. There was this lovely woman. Her name is Cheryl. Dolly and Crackers were her two sheep.
We've had Sian squished in a minivan travelling through Malawi. We've had Georgie running in Ottawa. Sally putting her bees to bed in Snowdonia. Cheryl in her stables in Pembrokeshire with her sheep. That is Ruth's favourite. I quite like the minivan in Malawi. That sounds so exciting, doesn't it? Or actually the bees as well. Take them all. Thank you. Keep them coming.
Love a bee.
I would quite like to have bees in another life, maybe one day. But before I do that, we've got a lot of politics to talk about. But please keep the pictures coming. WhatsApp us on the burner phone on 07934 200 444 or email us at electoraldysfunction@sky.uk. Now, on this episode, we'll reflect on the government's first 100 days, which is about to land on Sunday. That is the moment. It comes after a big shake-up in Downing Street. I cannot wait to hear what you've got to say about that, Harriet. We're also going to get into the Conservative leadership race now that we have the final two contenders. Ruth's pick is out. I cannot wait to ask you about that, Ruth. And I'm going to give you the lowdown on why my interview with the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson didn't happen in the end. I have also read quite a lot of his book, so I think we could talk a little bit about that. I'm sure Ruth will be delighted to talk about that. She's grimacing at me on these cameras right as we speak. Now, this weekend marks Keir Starmer's first 100 days as Prime Minister, and it will also mark a week since a total reset in Downing Street after the PM changed his top team. Now, we have had loads of questions come in about Sue Gray and the shake-up. Now, Sue Gray was his chief of staff. She was brought in from the civil service to great fanfare because she was going to do the transition to government for a Labour Party that had been out of power for 14 years. And she was the great hope of someone that knew how to get on with the business of government. But he has replaced her, and he has replaced her with Morgan McSweeney, who had in the past been his chief of staff, was moved out when Sue Gray was moved in, or shortly before Sue Gray was moved in. And Morgan McSweeney ran the campaign. He ran the election campaign. So he's very central to the Starmer operation. And now he is the chief of staff. It's been quite the drama. Harriet, do you think Labour can call the first 100 days a success?
Well, if you look at the opinion polls, you would definitely not call it a success. You would be concerned about it. But I think that there is something quite artificial about the first 100 days. Somehow we've all slipped into the habit of pronouncing what the government's going to do in the first 100 days. But in fact, most of the things that government does don't actually impact on people's lives for much longer than 100 days. So it is a bit of a sort of artificial construct. I was just looking back at the things which the Labour government in 1997 did in its kind of first 100 days. And for example, we introduced the minimum wage bill, but it didn't come into effect until 1999, so 2 years later. So we're introducing the Employment Rights Bill, but it won't come into effect for another 2 years. And I also, when I was, going down memory lane there, happened upon the fact that there was a huge scandal when we first got in because of the Lord Chancellor's refurbishment of his apartment at public expense, not even a donor. And this was like back in 1997. His refurbishment for his Lord Chancellor's apartments was £650,000, of which £60,000 was wallpaper. And also we were rocked with the Bernie Ecclestone thing about him being in Downing Street lobbying against some proposed government policy and Tony Blair having to apologise for it. However, that didn't affect the opinion polls. Tony Blair still remained tremendously important. And I think it was something about the way he, for example, dealt with Princess Diana's death. You know, people just felt he was very in touch with how they were feeling, the way he absolutely stepped forward again, you know, building on John Major's work to deal with peace in Northern Ireland, that enabled him to get over these early kind of wrinkles. But I mean, I get the sense, you know, from cabinet ministers, they're all getting on with their job, but it's just those opinion polls. And we haven't, you know, got that long because we've got a big election in 2026 in Scotland. We can't hang around to get ourselves to be popular again.
And those opinion polls, I mean, Keir Starmer's personal ratings have really sunk, haven't they? And the opinion polls that you're referring to, I think, are Starmer's net approval ratings. They're going sharply in the wrong direction. This week, his approval rating fell to -33, a drop of 44 points since his post-election high. And one poll out this week putting Labour just 1 point ahead of the Tories. I think that might be what you're referring to, Harriet.
I'm not sure we are misremembering 1997 because there was a flurry of announcements. And one of the things that the Blair government that Harriet was a part of completely understood was what can be done by executive order and what has to go through Parliament. So it wasn't just about bills that get introduced that do take, you know, a year to get through the Parliament and royal assent and then a year to implement and all this other stuff. And she's absolutely right about that. But I distinctly remember Gordon Brown giving the Bank of England its independence 4 days into your term. I remember things like Jack Straw announcing that judicial inquiry into the Stephen Lawrence murder. I remember things like £43 million being just handed to prisons to help with overcrowding. So in terms of allocating budget to activity and having a drumbeat that happened every single day to show that this was a government that was desperate to get going on stuff. And I think the problem for Keir, he can absolutely get past this and he can rewrite the government and get it back on an even keel. And he's got a big microphone and he's got a big majority and he can, like Sue Gray can be a forgotten figure in 6 months if he gets things right. But he cannot waste time in trying to show an urgency in being a new government because he's just missed the first 3 months of that. Like nobody thinks this is a government in a hurry.
If people have been miserable, which they were at the end of the Tory years, and really hopeful for a new government, I think a sort of basic entitlement for people is to feel confident in and supportive of their government and that the government is on their side and is doing good things. So I always feel anxious if people don't feel that. And currently, certainly according to the opinion polls, that is the case. I mean, I hate it when people say, oh, it's all about presentation, because usually it's not about presentation. Usually it's about substance. But I do think giving people a narrative to pace them through the difficult times until the good times and what the good times are going to look like and what is going to be underpinning the good times is very important. And there's a lot of foreign stuff going on. He's been abroad so many times because there's so many issues, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Europe, whether it's what's going on in the States, whether it's Ukraine. I mean, he's had more foreign affairs issues to deal with than most new prime ministers have.
And I think this is where Sue Gray got unstuck. And I think it's because she's not a politician. I think it's the very thing that he hired her for, which was she was a civil servant that understood how governments worked. The drumbeat from this new government was not fast enough. And that's what allowed, in a sense, the media to make more and more and more of the fact that they're not doing enough. We can spend loads of time poring over expenses and freebies and all the rest of it because there wasn't anything else to talk about because they weren't making 2 announcements a day every day. And I think that she was so fixated on what delivery looked like, she sort of almost forgot what all these staging posts before you get to the end point looks like.
This gets to the point about the grid, is that is that if you don't be putting forward, today the government is going to focus and tell you about and give you some more information about what's going to be happening on X. If there's a bit of a sort of hiatus or a vacuum, or a story is put out but it's not a big enough story, then all these other stories, which are not the ones that the government want to be highlighting, like free gifts and things like that, then come to the fore.
And I should explain actually what the grid is. The grid is, it sits within government inside the bowels of number 10. And it's basically a grid of announcements. So it's kind of, these are our policies, this is the grid, this is when we're going to roll them out, this is our news agenda, this is how we're going to set the weather. And basically, the better control and grip our government has on a grid, the better control it has on the message. And I think that we're all agreeing in different ways that this is a government that lost control of the narrative.
And the way it works is that number 10 will have a sort of radar going round and be speaking to each department and say, right, what do you want on the grid? And each department will be competing like mad to saying, we want this on the grid. And number 10 will be saying, well, we just don't think it's developed enough, or we don't think it's a good enough story, or actually it's got a downside. And the departments will have a list of things because they will want their stuff to get allocated a day on the grid. Anytime secretaries of state have been going out recently, their announcements have not been big enough. And therefore, what's happened is they've just been asked about all the other stuff, which they haven't been out there to talk about and would rather not be talking about, like spectacles and clothes.
I do think there was a bit of a circular firing squad as well in number 10 over the grid, because there were different briefings about how Sue Gray had been in charge of the grid. And then I heard from friends of Sue Gray that Sue Gray wasn't in charge of the grid. There's an admission in all of that there was a communications issue whereby the government wasn't presenting the programme of what they're actually doing. And I think that has been a massive issue for them, because actually today they're putting out their workers' rights proposals. They've done some renters reform stuff as well. They're just not landing it with the public. And if you have a situation where you have a prime minister that on the eve of his first 100 days has to completely reboot his number 10 operation, there is no way that you can spin that as a positive.
Well, I think that getting the right ministerial team, as well as getting the right team of people working in number 10, is of absolute central importance. But the most important thing is that at the end of the day, you actually get it how you need it and how it works. And hopefully we're at that point.
Well, some people are blaming one woman for what they see as a dreadful first 100 days. After weeks of briefings against her, Sue Gray resigned from being Starmer's chief of staff last week. We were of the early view that when the briefings began, that Starmer wouldn't sack her. Certainly Ruth and I had a view that it would look weak and he didn't want to be bounced by leakers. You, I think, Harriet, said that as this went on, I think we got a bit shakier on that, because she had become the story to the point that however he felt about it, was she a problem he couldn't now solve? This kind of scapegoating of Sue Gray is very convenient. I just don't think that one person speaks to this dysfunction. It's a wider cultural issue. Look, before we get into what's happened, we should actually explain maybe the roles in Downing Street, because maybe people out there don't necessarily understand what the Chief of Staff does. Now, Lucian sent this question in. He says, who has more authority, the Chief of Staff or the Deputy Prime Minister? I previously would have thought it would be the Deputy Prime Minister, but in light of recent events, I'm now not sure. Now, given that we have a former shadow Deputy Prime Minister on hand to help you, Lucian, Harriet, can you explain who does what and who holds the power?
That is such an interesting question and, made me cudgel my brains about it. And I think that the Chief of Staff has more power because the Chief of Staff is, to all intents and purposes, the Prime Minister. So if the Chief of Staff rings up a department and speaks to the Secretary of State and says, you've got to do this, that is the Prime Minister speaking. And I remember when I was bringing forward the Equality Bill. And it seemed like every single government department was blocking me. The Department of Health said you can't do it because if we have age discrimination provisions, the NHS will go bankrupt. Local government was saying we can't do it because we can't have these public sector duties to promote equality. We're too busy. The business department said everybody would go out of business if you do this. So it was completely blocked. So I went in to see Gordon Brown and said, this is absolutely hopeless. It's a manifesto commitment and every single government department all my colleagues are blocking it. He said, right, we're going to unblock it. And he said to his chief of staff, we're doing this now. Can you unblock it? And literally all those objections, which had been holding everything up, bang, they were gone, because that was the power of the Prime Minister, and it's transmitted through the Chief of Staff. The Prime Minister cannot afford to have the Deputy Prime Minister resigning or failing or ganging up against him. So that the Deputy Prime Minister has got a lot of sort of secondary power. You'll remember with John Prescott, he was a very different figure from Tony Blair. He had a different sort of power. And it's the same with Angela Rayner. But the most important thing is that everybody's got to be working together as a team. And the whole thing with Sue Gray and Morgan McSweeney is a Labour loyalist, intelligent, hardworking. Sue Gray's a very experienced civil servant, full of integrity, with masses of wisdom. And it was a bit paradoxical that having two such good people, that somehow a way could not be found for them to work together. So I don't think we really know the quotes truth, whatever the truth is about what happened. We know what the outcome was, which is Sue Gray is out. And incidentally, we've now got a complete male front line in number 10, and that is not okay. We've got lots of women in the cabinet, but we've now got a sort of male front line in number 10. And that is a problem, because it matters what's happening in the engine room as well as those who are in ministerial and parliamentary positions.
I mean, I think this Deputy Prime Minister thing is a bit of a nonsense. Now, the Labour Party take it more seriously than the Tories because the deputy leader of the Labour Party has their own franchise, their own electorate, their own mandate. The whole thing about Deputy Prime Ministers is they don't actually exist in the Constitution. They're not part of the machinery of government. You can call somebody the Deputy Prime Minister. They can, in fact, be a Deputy Prime Minister, but the Deputy Prime Minister has no reserve powers. It's not like the United States, where the position of the Vice President has an actual place within the Constitution and they're next in line. You don't have to have a Deputy Prime Minister. You can have a First Secretary of State who is sort of above their cabinet colleagues.
I don't like to lower the tone ever, because usually that's for Ruth and you to do, Beth. But actually, do you remember when Margaret Thatcher had Willie Whitelaw as her Deputy Prime Minister and pronounced without a shred of humour, every woman needs a Willie?
I love that quote. She was a master because she was the first woman Prime Minister, because there was so much made of her gender, because there was so much made about how the fact she was a man in women's clothing, she tried to rule like a man and all the rest of it, that she absolutely knew what she was doing. And she also liked to subvert it.
Ruth, I want to ask you about, when did Sue Gray become this liability that he couldn't protect, that actually she was not the asset, she was the liability? And then I want to come back to the woman issue that you were talking about, Harriet, because I think that's really interesting. But Ruth, what do you think changed from the he needs to save her to he needs to cut her loose?
Do you know, it's funny how you associate people. As I'm always on about owning the adjective, it's all about ruthless Keir Starmer. Ruthless Keir Starmer has done this, and ruthless Keir Starmer has done that. I'm not sure if that was a sign of strength and ruthlessness, or whether that was a sign of weakness. But I think Harriet's point about the club around Keir is entirely male at the top level, is right. And I think that's a worry, because we know in everything, we know that diversity of thought makes better policy.
I want to pick up on that, because there is this whole narrative about Keir's ruthless and he'll cut people loose. It was definitely done, I think, from what I have had conversations around, because he kind of wanted to clear the decks before the 100 days anniversary. Like, he literally, it was like, the 100 days is happening this Sunday, let's reset, we need a reset. I did ask someone in the team about this idea that he's been bounced by the leakers, and actually that is a sign of weakness, not strength, that he has been bounced, that he cannot control the briefings around his operation, that he cannot protect his chief of staff, who he basically, lured over from a very senior job in the civil service. I know Sue Gray had a really rough time in government because she'd been asked to do the Partygate report by Boris Johnson. She did that. She became an probably not willing public figure because of that. This is what this person said to me about it when I said, is it we? They said, the PM recognised it was going wrong and moved to make it right. Weak leaders let dysfunction run on. He didn't have the right people in the right places, and he moved to make the changes he wanted to make. And that was the view, that the government had become unfocused, that Sue Gray was becoming the story. Friends of hers that I've spoken to, she has completely gone to ground. But when I talk to people around her or people that know her, what they told me was that the more she was in the headlines, the more she hated it, because the more she knew that Keir was going to sack her or move her. And there have been people within Number 10 that have said to me that they think unfairly she got kind of marked, a target on her back.
I never like my prime ministers to be ruthless. If anybody in Downing Street is using that word, I would ask them to reflect on that. We want them to be decisive. We want them to act with determination, but we don't want ruthlessness.
Keir Starmer himself told me he was ruthless.
Yes, I know, but I'm just via you, Beth, and my good friend Ruth, doing my normal advisory function, which is that ruthless has got a bit of a sort of not quite right connotation. I think decisive is what he should be focusing on. It's always more problematic when it's a senior woman that falls than when it's a senior man, because there are bags of senior men around. And they pointed out, as they want to do, that some of the deputies are women, and, I know them and they're very good people. The other thing is that the briefing exposed the problem, which then he had to be ruthless/decisive about. So basically, probably even without the public briefing, there would have been sufficient dysfunction that he would have had to act to sort it out. But the briefing somehow added to it and precipitated it.
On the woman issue, it was really interesting because there have been talk and reports of the boys around Starmer. I know that some of the senior men in Number 10 absolutely hate this sort of characterisation. And I did notice some of the female journalists on Twitter and stuff, there was a bit of some people saying, there's a sort of sense of the boys. And then there was quite a lot of counter briefing that some of my colleagues were reporting about, making the point that the two deputy chief of staff are both superb women. If you speak to people around it, they don't paint Sue as a kind of virtuous angel that never did anything wrong. They would say that she could be difficult, that she misread some of the advisors. But there was a more substantive reason to that, which was, as I understand it from what some of her allies have told me, she was of the view that the team that had worked in opposition for Keir Starmer maybe didn't have the heft and experience to actually run government for Keir Starmer. And what they have lost in Sue Gray is someone that did understand Whitehall, did understand the civil service, had worked in the civil service for 3 decades and understood how government worked. And so when we talk about the reset, you can see the reasons why Starmer had to do it, but bloody hell, it comes with a lot of risk. To finish that off, as one of Keir Starmer's allies said to me just this week, the Prime Minister has the view that the government is not about the first 100 days, it's about the first 5 years. And you can look at lots of examples in the whole genesis of the 100 days, which came from the US, whereby people have got off to a terrible start and then gone on to be very successful, or got off to a cracker of a start and then evaporated in a burst of flames. So
it's quite insular, though, to the idea of measuring yourself and your performance by days. And actually, you should be measuring yourself and your performance by outcomes.
Well, we've got another story of political brutality after the break, so don't go anywhere. We're going to fill you in this week on how it's been for the Tories. Bloody hell. We'll come back. Right, we are back. We are back. We have got to talk about the Tory leadership contest because it is properly heating up. We've got the final two candidates. It's Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick. There you go. I told you, don't underestimate the Jenrick, Ruth Davidson. I said it. Your man Cleverly, he's gone.
Yep.
It was a big surprise. I mean, honestly, I couldn't... There was an audible gasp in the room. You could hear the MPs as it happened, just audibly gasping in shock that James Cleverly, he went out. He'd been in the lead in the penultimate round. He'd surged ahead after his conference barnstorming performance. He managed to lose 2 supporters between Tuesday and Wednesday. It's all the more confounding because the guy that got knocked out was Tom Tugendhat, who again was a centrist moderate MP, so was on the wing of the party that James was representing. And yet the party somehow ended up with the 2 right-wingers in the final. I would say this is a colossal up. I am not allowed to use that word on this pod. I cannot think of a better word to describe this absolute cock-up.
I was chatting with a former Tory party chairperson when the results came through. And because they knew that I'd been backing James, they were like, did he lend votes and then screw himself over by accident? And there was a lot of that was going around from people that were thinking that his campaign team had like lent some votes to Robert Jenrick, who it looked as if he had a fighting chance of beating if they got to the final 2, and not Kemi and all the rest of it. And I said, absolutely not, like, because everybody knew that the threshold was 40. You needed at least 40. They wouldn't have been able to fall below that and feel confident that he would get through to the final 2. And he has had a roller coaster. I mean, he was an outsider. And I think when this race started, he was the 5th favourite at the bookies. To then lose it to come 3rd when it was down to 3, when it was, as you say, Beth, the moderate that went out, nobody expected that either. But I have a very, very, very simple rule in politics, which is if there is a suggestion of cock-up or a suggestion of conspiracy, it is always cock-up.
Always a cock-up.
Every single time, without fear, without favour, without question, always cock-up. What happened was MPs thought they were too bloody clever and they wanted to get the other person out. So there was loads of people that supported Kemi, loads of people that supported Jenrick. Both of them wanted Cleverly in the race against one or other of them. They really wanted to block the other. And they all decided that what we'll do is, Cleverly's through anyway, we're going to vote for either Jenrick or Kemi to stop either Kemi or Jenrick. And then guess what? They got more votes. That genie that Keir Starmer had working for him on the run-up that gave him every sort of wish that was going through is working overtime. And I saw one of the MPs was asking if they needed to declare this in the Register of Interest as a gift from the Tory party.
This is what I got last night because this was quite late. Someone got back to me, a Cleverly ally, just to reaffirm what Ruth said. They said MPs thought they'd second guess and vote against the person they least liked rather than the person they actually wanted, despite us all pleading for MPs to vote for their favourite candidate, James. In a smaller party, that kind of thing makes a disproportionate difference, leaving you, this is me, not my source, with 2 right-wingers that Ruth now has to pick between. So come on, Ruth.
Well, I'm going to have to wait until they send me their electoral communication with my voting slip and I'll see what they have to say.
Come on.
It's a busman's choice for me, you know, and I think it is going to be pretty difficult.
Do you think when Kemi or Jenrick fails, that there's a chance that James Cleverly could stand again and come back? Because he did a good campaign and people are saying nice things about him. Now, not me, of course, but other people are saying nice things about him. Perhaps he can just
You said you were warming up to him. In the last episode, you said you were beginning to warm up to him.
That was obviously a mistake. I was obviously, I've toughened up again. What about him keeping his powder dry, being Mr. Popular, being Mr. Teamly, and then you can have him as your candidate again, Ruth?
Well, the thing is, it's not like it's a mask that he puts on. He genuinely is quite collegiate, and that's why people quite like him. So dropped him a little WhatsApp last night just to say, look, I'm really sorry, that's how it went.
So he'll be the prince across the water.
No, I don't think. No, I don't think he will be the prince across the water, because I think he'll have a job. I think almost because it's such a small parliamentary grouping, they'll all have to have jobs. You don't get to sort of take a back seat, and he will work with whoever wins, and he's already worked with 4 prime ministers.
He'll be seen as prince across the water. So every time one of those two, whichever gets it, falters, everybody will be going, oh God, if only we'd have had James Cleverly.
I'm not sure about that so much. It's not a David Miliband situation, I don't think. Also, the fact that he physically left Parliament, it allowed his legend to grow. If he's in there doing a job and shadowing one of the offices of state.
The point that Harriet's making, and I think that it's a point that's already being sort of chatted about in SW1 in Westminster, is whether or not in a couple of years' time, the Conservative Party might be doing another leadership race.
I think there's a good chance of that.
Do you?
I do, because I think what was exposed at conference with both of these candidates is that they can take a misstep. There's gaffes that happen all the time. There's gaffes that happen around you and to you that you have no control over, and you've got to clean up after yourself. There's gaffes that are of your making. And I think what was really instructive was neither of them drew a line under it, took their lumps on the chin and moved on. They both dug in. Jenrick didn't take a step back. He didn't take the video down. Kemi absolutely went out and continued to smash her way forward and be combative, which is her nature. And I think there is a fundamentalist misunderstanding of what growing from opposition is. And it's about persuading people. It's about telling them that they can trust you, that you can deliver for them. It's a lot of round tables. It's a lot of listening. It's a lot of bringing people on side. It's a lot of being humble and asking for people to help you. And neither of them, I think, are suited to that in terms of their personality types.
Ruth, it seems to me what you're saying there is that you think that the wrong choice will be made, whoever of these two it is. And there is a real chance that the party will have to rethink mid-term the leadership, and actually maybe James could come back and could be the leader that takes the party into the next general election. It's not unfeasible, is it?
I think having run and lost, I think he would take some persuading. He would have to want to know that there was a lot of people that supported him and would follow him. I mean, I know people had to approach him this time. It wasn't his idea to run because he believes in service. He's not in personal ambition at all.
Bluntly, is this an IDS moment? Is this what the party's going to do? They're picking the sort of IDS character over the Portillo character, and then they're going to have to revisit it. Like, these are not election-winning options.
Well, look, I mean, my fear was always that we picked an IDS, and then when that didn't work, we went further right and we picked another Michael Howard, and then we suddenly decided that we'd been out of government for 10 years. We didn't like that, and we wanted somebody that could actually take the centre ground and win. I had high hopes because actually this has been a pretty civil fight. I was actually a bit encouraged by the contest as it has been. But yeah, I mean, I think I would hope that whoever wins out of the two of them understands that their job is not to speak to an ever smaller and ever reducing number of people who are already Conservative.
And finally, what did James say in his message back? Was he all right, or was he very gutted?
He thanked me for the support that I gave him and the stuff that I did for him in Scotland. He was he was pretty equivocal about it, actually. And he sort of ended by saying, we're both needed to help keep the show on the road and keep the Tory party a wide and broad ship, which is where we work, because, I mean, that's just his nature. I know I keep saying this, and I know everybody thinks that I'm sucking up to him. I'm not. He just is a good guy that wants the Tory party to do well and will work with anybody and be part of a team. It just is who he is.
And you haven't decided who you'll back?
I don't think I'm not going to announce. I don't think.
Can you bring yourself to vote for one of them, though? Can you actually even vote for one of them, do you think?
Yeah, I don't think I'll spoil my ballot. I think I would vote for one of them.
It's a secret ballot, but you'll have to tell us.
Yeah.
Just between the three of us.
Well, I tell you what, it is a bloody brutal business. And I called one of James's team. I'd actually been doing something else, so I missed the live moment. And then I called one of the team about an hour later after the vote, and I was like, just checking in, and they'd all gone to the pub. And I said, how are you doing? He just went, it's absolutely brutal. And what do you say? It was absolutely brutal. Let's move on then. One of your favourite politicians, Boris Johnson, one of your favourite Conservatives, Are you okay, Ruth? She's like, Beth, I can't take it. I have read Unleashed, not all of it. I can only do it in bite-sized pieces. It's a lot of Boris Johnson all in one sitting. Ladies, are you going to be reading it?
I might well read it, but I'm certainly not going to buy it.
Okay, you can borrow my copy. Ruth?
I think it's unlikely, yeah.
Because it was like, you know those cartoons where it's like, kapow, boom, smash, wham, whack. It was like a cartoon character, Boris Johnson, biffing his way through with a kaboom, a boom, a boosterism, a Brexit, the Surrender Act. I did it. And it was all Jolly Japes, boosterism. I mean, there were manly pep talks with Harry, invading the Netherlands, nearly being swept out to sea in a kayak. I mean, Jesse Norman, actually, the former Conservative MP, who is also a writer. So he wrote a review in the FT, in the Financial Times, and it just, for me, it perfectly summed up. He said it was a book that would delight his supporters, infuriate his detractors. It was, as a history, unlikely to move the dial. He basically describes him as a hero of his own drama, and where he effectively argues, to sum it up, that in the end he was sort of brought down by the jealousy of his rivals, basically, because he was sort of a politician where everyone's either in love with him or hopelessly jealous of him.
The man is 60 years old. 60 years old, and this idea that you either are jealous of him or in love with him, it's just so juvenile. You are a grown man. You are a father of many children. You've been the prime minister of a G7 nation. Like, at what point does personality seed into some level of experience or gravitas or heft or character or something?
I have to say, when I was reading the book, I sort of started reading it. It opens with Brexit and the proroguing of Parliament, right? And I'm there, and I remember covering that story, and I'm reading Boris Johnson's account of this story, and I'm reading it thinking, it's a kind of Boris Johnson boostery sort of spin on how he saw his time in office. One thing that I did notice at the end of the book, he basically ends with this is what, if you want to win, this is what you must do. And it's basically his plan for Britain, right? I mean, a lot of it's what Labour's doing, which is infrastructure and housing and levelling up and all these things. Is he trying to make a comeback, Ruth? Is that partly what this is about?
I think he likes to think that people will come and court him and beg him to come back and all the rest of it. And I'm not sure that's going to happen for him. I'm not sure that he's going to want to give up the beaches and speeches life that he's got now to go back into Parliament with the scrutiny that it has, because he hated the scrutiny the first time around. And the scrutiny is only going to get more and more for elected officials, as we've seen from freebies. He's never had any time for the little people, and the little people constitute everybody apart from him. He literally thinks of himself as on a different plane from others. And I honestly, I'm not sure that the conspiracy theory that he's planning a comeback will be borne out. I'll believe it when I see it.
And Harriet, you were chair of the Privileges Committee that found Johnson had misled Parliament over Partygate. In some of the interview rounds, he said, he regrets apologising. He regrets this blanket apology he gave. In the book, he insists again he broke no COVID rules and that he was victim of a conspiracy, that his MPs had got over agitated, that some of them hadn't forgiven him about Brexit anyway. Some of them were jealous about his sort of seemingly endless ability to be successful, so wanted to bring him down. What do you make of all of that?
It just reminds you that of his not engaging with the facts and just engaging with bluster to try and make things seem different from what they were. Photographs and information arrived from out of Downing Street that showed that things were happening which were not where Boris Johnson was there, and lots of them were there, and they were not 2 meters apart. So there was a police investigation. But he came to the House of Commons, and when he was asked, did you and did everybody in Downing Street comply with the rules and guidance, the rules that have been passed by the House of Commons and the guidance that Number 10 was promulgating? Did you abide by that? And he said, we abided by that. I abided by that at all times. So the House of Commons asked the Privileges Committee, in the light of the information that came out from Procura and then came out further in Sue Gray's investigation, to ourselves investigate whether or not what he'd said to the House of Commons about never having broken the rules and having complied with all the guidance about the 2-metre social distancing that he was promulgating, whether he'd misled the House of Commons. And when we, in the Privileges Committee, amalgamated all the evidence, and then we had him in front of us to ask him the questions so that he could have a chance to explain why all the evidence that was pointing in one direction was not as it seemed. We knew when we were preparing for our cross-examination of him that he would just throw up a smokescreen of bluster and not answer the question in terms of what it was, straightforwardly. So he says in the extracts that I've seen, he says, I shouldn't have apologised because I didn't eat birthday cake. I only ate a salad. And that is classic Boris Johnson, because the rules are nothing to do with whether you've eaten a salad or birthday cake. The rules were whether you were within 2 meters distance of each other. And the requirement was that you should be totally honest when you speak to the House of Commons. So he has not in any way engaged with that really important thing, which is if you're the Prime Minister, you have got to tell the truth to the House of Commons. If we get to a situation where the Prime Minister can come to the House of Commons and tell lies and nothing is done about it, our democracy is finished. Because what's the point of Parliament if Parliament can be kept in the dark and have the wool pulled over his eyes?
Part of the reason I had been reading the book was because I was going to interview Boris Johnson on stage at the Cheltenham Literary Festival this week. You might have seen online that I pulled out of that interview. The reason I did that was really simple, which was I had been asked if I wanted to interview him on stage at this festival. They were selling tickets. It was going to be a big audience. I agreed to do that. I knew it was a lot of work. It was a long interview, about 45 minutes. What happened was I was told by the Boris Johnson team that they had agreed that this was a live-only event, that it couldn't be recorded in any way. I knew that I couldn't take cameras in. That was fine. But they said I couldn't do an audio recording. Now, in journalism, we have off-record and on-record. On record, if you get the drift, right? So if I'm a journalist going into a room to interview a former Prime Minister in front of 1,000 people, it's on record. What they said was I wasn't allowed to record the interview at all, so I couldn't have an audio recording of it that I could then use as a transcript, as a record of this interview and what passed. And I just wasn't prepared to do that because it's in front of 1,000 people. It could get interpreted in various different ways. Other people might be unofficially recording it. Probably news stories could have flown from it. There'd be journalists sitting in there probably recording it. And I just felt that in those circumstances, as the journalist conducting the interview, I needed a formal transcript. They wouldn't let me do that. So I decided that in good conscience, I was not comfortable with that. There's a thing called Chatham House in journalism, which means that sometimes you might go to a room and interview someone under Chatham House rules. And that basically means what happens in the room kind of stays in the room. But I thought they're asking me to agree to Chatham House terms when there's no way this is going to stay in the room. Anyway, I didn't do the interview, people. So someone else is doing it.
I think it's something that's worth saying here, though, because one of the great collapses of trust in this country hasn't just been in institutions, so in believing in politicians and, not liking sort of official announcements and stuff, but the amount of abuse that journalists get and how everybody says that they're biased this and it's fake news that. I think it's a real shame because journalism is a hard job and it's a brilliant job in a terrible industry, is what I've always said, being a journalist. Great job, terrible industry. But the amount of abuse that journalists now get because they're painted as some form of bias or agenda, and it's a really tough gig these days.
And also, before we wrap it, just to give people context about why it does matter to have recordings of interviews that you have done with senior politicians. You might remember the Conservative leadership race between Andrew Leadsom and Theresa May. A very brilliant journalist at the Times called Rachel Sylvester did an interview with Andrew Leadsom where she made some remarks about Theresa May not having children. And this became very contentious because Andrea Leadsom had said in some form in this interview something along the lines of she was more invested she had a greater stake in the country because she was a mother, which of course was probably personally very painful for Theresa May. But by the by on all of that, this became a massive hot potato and it effectively torpedoed Andrea Leadsom's bid to become the next Prime Minister. She then contested this and said Rachel Sylvester had misquoted her, had misrepresented her, but Rachel Sylvester had an audio recording of the interview because that is what you do. Because if you do an interview and it becomes contested, as a journalist, you need to have your evidence, your proof about what passed between you and your interviewee. And that's why being on the record for some things is non-negotiable, right?
It's not just journalists that should be taping every recording between a journalist and a politician. The politician should be too, so that they can also challenge the journalist if they think the spin or the headline writer or whatever has gone beyond it.
Well, in the end, Boris Johnson did a number of interviews. I didn't interview him, but if he does want to ever come and do an on-the-record interview with me, I would be more than happy to do that. That is it. You can always get in touch if you want to ask us a question. Send us your photos and send us voice notes to the burner phone 07934 200 444. Email us at electoraldysfunction@sky.uk. Thank you for listening in what has been another bumper political week, and we will see you next week. Goodbye.